Thank you very much. It was a lovely introduction. I feel a bit of a fraud when you say etymologist, because I have a true etymologist here in the form of Philip, who I'll introduce later, who is a far greater expert than me, but my passion for language is absolutely spot on. And one of my favourite quotes is from Dennis Potter, the playwright, who said, "The trouble with words is you never know whose mouths they've been in." And when it comes to English, there have been a lot of mouths. As far as Britain's concerned, the language that became English arrived in the 5th century with Germanic warrior tribes from across the sea. And the Anglo-Saxon historian Bede reports of the groans of the Britons who suffered at the hands of the barbarians. And the image, I think, is a really powerful one. English arriving across the ocean like a fury from hell. But it wasn't quite English yet. It would take hundreds of years, about 300 years, before English emerged as the victor in the battle of languages that ensued between Celtic and Gaelic, leftover Latin from the Romans, splinter dialects brought over by the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons. But when it did become Old English, it, of course, had a huge influence on later generations and the English that we still speak today. Almost all of the 100 most common words in our language worldwide, wherever it's spoken, come from Old English. But the rest of our language is full of examples of just how good our language has been at plundering. It's a notorious Hoover English. It sucks up words from every single tongue it encounters, whether or not that encounter has been a happy one or not. So from the legacy of the Vikings to the French that flooded in after 1066, or the foreign cuisines that we still relish today, including chicken tikka masala, which I think Philip will tell me, correct me on this, but I think this is entirely our own creation. It is our national dish, but I don't think we imported it from anywhere. We just simply created it. And yet, despite all this plundering, we still view our language as our own. And I get day in, day out complaints from Countdown viewers, the programme that I appear on, who are aghast at Americanisms in our dictionary. And if you, Simon, in his book, as you're about to hear, he quotes Samuel Johnson's definition of the adjective English: belonging to England, hence English is the language of England. And 250 years on, I don't think our attitudes have changed very much, but the English-speaking landscape has changed dramatically. English is spoken by some 450 million people all over the world, and speakers of English as a second language number 1.5 billion. And yet we are fiercely protective still of a language that in fact hasn't really been ours for a very long time. And we're afraid as well as protective. We've got verbing and slang and texting, emojis, awesome sourcing. All of these, for many people, represent a parting of the ways, really, between English or proper English and the improper kind. Is this fear a new thing? No, Simon says. Look back to a manual of mistakes and improprieties from 1884, which he quotes, and you'll see the following. Don't pronounce incorrectly. Listen to the conversations of cultivated people, and if in doubt, consult the dictionary. Don't use slang. There is some that is gentleman's slang and other slang that is vulgar. If one does not know the difference, let him avoid slang altogether, and then he will be safe. But that word safe, that's the one thing that English has never been. And how English became English, I've lost my book. Sorry. It's a good read. How English became English is a really compelling look at the changing fortunes of a language across its 1,500 years and across 7 continents. And Simon takes in almost every aspect of its development, including those that have been hotly contested, not just in recent years, but throughout its history. And crucially, and very bravely, Simon also dares to predict its future. So please welcome, first of all, Simon Horobin. I'm just going to introduce the rest of the panel. Philip Durkin, who I've mentioned before, is Deputy Chief Editor of the wonder that is the Oxford English Dictionary. He's led the OED's team of specialist etymology editors since the late 1990s. His research interests, apart from etymology, the history of the English language and of the English lexicon, medieval multilingualism, there's a word or a term, and approaches to historical lexicography. Simon, who I've mentioned, is Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Oxford. He's a Fellow of Magdalen. He's the author of Does Spelling Matter, another great book published by OUP, and other books on the history of English, including the language of Chaucer. He also writes for the Oxford Dictionary's Words blog. Faramerz Dabhoiwala is the author of The Origins of Sex, a history of the first sexual revolution, published by Penguin and OUP. He's now working on the history and politics of English since the Middle Ages. He will be moving, sadly, to become not sadly, because I was at Princeton as well. He's been moving to become a senior research scholar at Princeton University. It's a brilliant place, I have to say. And Martin Wynne is a digital research methods specialist with a role in the university divided between IT services, the E-Research Centre, and the Faculty of Linguistics, Philology and Phonetics. Lots of mouthfuls there. Most of all, though, Martin is an expert in corpus linguistics, and a corpus, Martin I'm sure will explain, is a vast database of current language. It can be any kind of language, but particularly used for dictionary making. It is the most wonderful thing. Martin runs the Oxford Text Archive and is a director of Clarin, a major Europe-wide initiative to make digital language collections more accessible and easier to use. Please welcome our panel. Philip, may I start with you?
I'm really pleased to be talking here in this event centering on Simon's book. If you haven't read it, read it. It's a super book. One thing I really like is that it foregrounds the importance of seeing English, and any language for that matter, in its social and cultural contexts. As Susie said, I work for the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, which is a historical dictionary and covers a huge chronological range from the earliest written records, around about the 8th century, and trying to reconstruct even a bit further back than that, through to the present day. And thinking about it, I'm going to sort of give an OED slant on some of the topics that Simon talks about. I think that it's really important when approaching something like the OED that's trying to cover a huge chronological depth and a huge range of different varieties of English today, to think about the different contexts of English in the present and in the past, and to think about how different English was in earlier periods. Both the content of the language was different in terms of vocabulary, the meanings of individual words, which have often changed quite dramatically. Think about famous examples like silly, which used to mean blessed. How words were spelt differently, how they were pronounced differently, how they were inflected, the syntax that governed how words were used in sentences, but the contexts were very different as well. Modern standard written English, which most of us use day to day, certainly in writing, maybe in our interactions with our family, certainly in our business interactions, with its more or less stable spelling system and its broad similarity of core vocabulary across billions of users worldwide, is a product of social and cultural circumstances and hasn't always been with us. And the strong association of particular spoken accents like received pronunciation with the standard written form is something even more modern. So I'd like to push things back to the Middle Ages. Susie already hinted at that, so I'm going to do that for a minute or two. If we look back at, say, the late Middle Ages, if you're thinking about the 1300s, 1400s, English existed in a huge number of competing local varieties with their own distinctive vocabularies, grammars and pronunciation, and without a widely accepted standard that was sitting on top of those. So a radically different situation from the situation today, unless the variety sitting at the top was actually either French or Latin, which up until certainly the period of the Black Death, the late 1300s, both of those languages occupied many of the most important prestigious functions in legal use, in government, in administration, even in business records and so on, which weren't typically kept in English. And even in the school environment, up until the late 1300s, it seems that those boys who were lucky enough to go to a school learnt French first and then learnt Latin through the medium of French and didn't have very much to do with English throughout their educational experience. The modern standard English we have today reflects a huge number of steps in a long chain. The adoption of English in official functions like law and government, as well as the business accounts and so on, the power of printing in spreading a particular selection of spellings and other linguistic conventions, the interplay between language and education, professions, social class, innumerable other factors. Acquisition of new vocabulary, especially huge layers of high prestige vocabulary coming into English from French and Latin. Susie spoke about the top 100 words, most frequent 100 words in contemporary English being mostly of Germanic origin. If you actually look a little bit further to the 1,000 most frequent words in modern written use, about half of those are of French or Latin origin. And that's very important in introducing a layer of uniformity in the lexicon, in that these words are found geographically throughout Britain and throughout all of those areas of the world where English is spoken today. Levelling out the degree of regional variation in core vocabulary which was found earlier and to some extent persists. A very different situation from the influence from Scandinavian languages, from Norse, where you had input from Norse settlers living side by side with English-speaking communities and gradually switching language to English over the generations. That's the sort of mechanism that led to borrowings like the pronoun they. That's a huge thing in linguistics for a personal pronoun to get borrowed from one language to another. It gets borrowed in that sort of setting where you've got different speech communities interacting in a speech community, switching its language over time. And then you can trace over several hundred years the period of moving from dialect to dialect within England, moving further south and southwest from the areas of core contact with Norse speakers. So the OED is struggling to take a long historical sweep to deal with the past where the language content was different and also where its settings were different. I'll give one very quick example. Think about the word metal. In contemporary English dictionary, you have two words pronounced that way, or at least two words pronounced that way. One, metal, the substance, one, mettle, a person's fibre. But in origin, they're the same word. It's just metal, mettle, is a metaphorical use of the substance. And what do you do in a dictionary that's trying to cover this huge, long sweep? How do you have something that's true of the present, where people's conception is that these are two different words? They spell them differently. They may know that in their past they share an origin. They may not know that. They may have a different conception in their minds about the origin of the mettle word, or they may never have given it a moment's thought. But back in the time of Shakespeare, they're clearly the same word. Examples from Julius Caesar. See whether their basest metal be not moved. Well, Brutus, thou art noble, yet I see thy honourable metal may be wrought from that it is disposed. Or this from Henry IV, part 2. For from Hotspur's metal was his party steeled, which once in him abated, all the rest turned on themselves like dull and heavy lead. How do you spell that in a modern spelling edition? Well, two of those examples are spelled mettle in the Oxford Shakespeare, and the other one's spelled metal. But you can see, it's quite arbitrary, because for Shakespeare, all of these senses are in play. He's playing on the breadth of senses of this word. What's the OED solution? Well, it tends to take a perspective that is anchored in the present. So it has two different entries, as you would in a contemporary English dictionary, but it tells you very clearly, when you're looking at earlier periods, this is actually the same word history that's diverged. And that's more or less the same approach in terms of variation around the world today as well. But the point of reference there is modern standard English. That's to say, the written variety that's used as a medium of communication around the world, that dominates academic discourse around the world, that's used by many people who don't have English as their native language throughout the world. That's no more the possession of me than it's the possession of, say, a Polish research chemist who writes his papers in it. And I've got 1 minute left, have I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go for
Okay.
1 minute would be good.
Simon talks about. So I wanted to pick out three words in the OED that I think show different slants on this. Simon picks out la, which is something I only know about it because I know it's in the dictionary and I've looked at its history. It's not part of my vocabulary. It's something that's found in Malaysian English, Singaporean English, and Bruneian English, borrowed from Malay. It's used in English in those varieties as a sentence modifier. OED, of course, has an entry for this, even though it isn't found in British or US English or other inner circle Englishes. If that's a new concept to you, Simon talks about it. So look in his book. But the reference point that the dictionary is framed around is international standard English, but this is labelled as only existing in English in these particular varieties. You may think, well, surely that's stretching an English dictionary in an odd way, but I'll give you a couple of counter-examples that might seem more logical to be in, but in a way they're very similar. Some dialect vocabulary. The word nesh has a range of meanings centering around soft, mild, weak. Maybe quite a lot of people know that word. It's been found as part of the English language since earliest times. It's got a perfectly clear Germanic etymology. It's been in English from Old English times, Anglo-Saxon times, through to the present, but today it survives only in various traditional local dialects. Or another one, poke, a word for a bag, which was probably borrowed from French in the Middle Ages. It could go back to Germanic again, which was once reasonably widespread use in British English. Today in standard English, it's found largely in the expression a pig in a poke, but it's found in lots of specialised uses in different vocabularies. Among fishermen in Scotland for a type of net, among whalers in North America for a type of float or buoy, among farmers in the north of England or Scotland for a type of swelling on a sheep's neck. So, round things, basically, Pussy, round, it's revolting, but yes. But, so this exists in lots of different people's languages, and I'm sure the people in the Newfoundland whalers don't know about the Scottish fishermen's use, they don't know about the Yorkshire farmer's use. It's possible to contain all of these in a dictionary like the OED that's trying best it can to record the English of everywhere, but everybody's English is slightly different. So if you're looking at a very large dictionary trying to reflect English as it's used today in its historical, in its geographical sweep and its social, cultural sweep, as well as English in its historical sweep, then you're going to find some things that are in your vocabulary, some things that aren't in your vocabulary, and some connections that go right back 2,000 years, and some things that have entered English in relatively recent past might be restricted now to certain speech communities, may have spread absolutely everywhere. So that's
Thank you.
more than my time up, I think.
Yeah, no, that was excellent, and lots of points, I think, for Simon to come back on there. But Martin, I think it's Martin next. Is that right? Or is it Farah next? No, sorry, it's Farah next. Apologies. Farah, your response.
Thank you. Well, when Philip was talking about how words have changed and the OED needs to reflect their evolving meaning, I was reminded of my favourite example, which is the word toilet brush, which in the first edition of the OED is described as something like a small brush for a lady to make her toilette with.
Smoothing the hair, I believe.
Smoothing the hair. Smoothing the hair. Anyway, so thank you for reminding me of that. Now, I had the great pleasure of being asked to review Simon's book for The Guardian, and I read it with great pleasure. It's fun, it's quirky, it's an easy read. Of course, when you send in your piece to The Guardian, it's what you've slaved over, and then what they print is something almost entirely different. And they cut out various things, and they cut out particularly a lot of my jokes, sadly. They also cut out my peroration, which was to remark on what a handy format it is, almost perfectly designed for a stocking. So can I just bring that back into my review and say, do, if you haven't already snapped it up, buy several copies. Very handy for any budding linguists you might have. But now the thing is, when I wrote, I've never met Simon. We've now been acquainted for the last 15 minutes, but it's the first time. And it's a great treat for a reviewer actually to meet an author, to be able to ask them questions about their book, because when you're reading it, that's the one thing you cannot do. And as I was reading it, certain questions did bubble up in my mind, and so I'm going to put 3 of them to Simon. At last I can find out the answers. And the first question is simply, Simon, who did you write this book for, apart from these lovely people here? And the reason I ask that is that every author has an audience in mind when they write, I think. But in this case, I could sense at various points in the book that to me anyway, there's a mild tension between the author, who of course I didn't know, but I conceived of as the broad-minded Professor Horobin, who's at ease with all sorts of variations in language, who thinks of English as, in that great phrase that Ella Kaboma used, the great Creole that we all share. A tension between his relaxed view and possibly the less broad-minded views of some of his putative readers, because I sensed, on the other hand, in the people he was addressing, a need for him to keep reassuring them that it's all right if people spell things slightly differently, it's all right if other foreigners speak our language. And so I guess I sensed what Susie referred to as, the people who say our language and how dare other people use it differently. And I wondered if you could reflect on that.
I remembered after Simon wrote Does Spelling Matter and you spoke at the Hay Festival, newspapers reported an audible gasp from the audience when he dared suggest that actually some spellings may not matter that much. So yes, big sighs, big gasps.
Did you have the audible gasp? Right. And the second question was simply, as a historian, as someone who's trying to think about the politics and the anthropology of English, as it were, historically, one thing that interests me is how is English very similar to other European languages? And I sensed again in the book, although this is only a book about English, it seems like some things happen, the implication might be that this is what happens to English, but actually a lot of the things that happen historically happen everywhere else in Europe. You get the rise of the vernacular in the 16th and 17th centuries, you get the increased standardization in the 18th century, you get this concern with the national language in the 19th century and the indoctrination of young people in correct grammar and so on. Those things are all shared. So could you reflect on how English is just like any other language in other ways as well? And the final question is the opposite of that. How is English really different? It's again a comparative question. Now, one obvious answer is its global spread and the way that it's taken over the globe. But of course, Spanish has done something quite similar. But what really interests me is the snobbery of English. How we have come to a pass where we have this conflation of verbal accent with social snobbery. Now, when and why did this happen? I don't think it happens in other languages. It doesn't happen in Dutch. It doesn't happen, as far as I know, in German. I don't think it happens in French or Italian. It doesn't even really happen in American English. They don't have that. Regional dialects are understood everywhere to be different, but this verbal snobbery, I think we're unique in that. Perhaps you could reflect on why, and maybe contradict me. I don't know if it's true.
Fantastic, thank you. Lots of questions to pick up on. I've made a note of some of them, so in case you need to. Oh, sorry. No, I was saying thank you, and lots of questions for Simon to pick up on. Sorry, I'll bring this back over here. We have one last response that comes from Martin, and then I will turn to Simon to respond.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. And since I've been tasked with talking about digital aspects and how the digital world is changing English, I thought it would be appropriate for me to actually make use of a computer for my short presentation. So I want to talk about how about Simon's book, and particularly in the context of what I've called here the digital turn, how electronic communications, worldwide computing networks are changing the English language. I'd like to say first of all how much I enjoyed reading the book. I think Simon achieved something really difficult in writing a very accessible book without dumbing it down. And I have to say, even though I am a linguist, I learned quite a lot from this short book for the general reader. So I would certainly recommend it for any reader. What I want to talk about, though, is the digital aspects of this. There's two ways of looking at this. Simon writes quite a lot in the book about electronic communication, what some people also call computer-mediated communication or discourse, meaning things like email, online chat, social media, etc. That's the main thing I want to talk about. What I actually do in my job is a slightly different aspect of the way the digital impinges on the English language, which is actually doing research using computers, looking at large data sets, the corpora or corpuses that Susie talked about. And I think one of my questions for Simon actually would be, to what extent was his research into this, informed by the possibilities of being able to search across large collections of English texts from the past, and in what ways that may have helped in his research and in writing this book. Okay, so what's new because of the digital? I think Simon addresses this in the book, and there's some very entertaining and interesting sections on this. He quotes David Crystal, who talks about speaking with your fingers, describing a new mode of communication. And it's often said that the ways that we communicate through computers are often a mixture of features of speech and writing. And I think that quote sums that up quite nicely. Here are some of the differences, why we can perhaps talk about a new mode of communication. And I'm thinking here mainly of things like using online chat, Twitter, and to an extent email as well. And in some ways you can say that these things are sort of time-based. You can see, if you think of looking at a Twitter feed, if you do that, you can see things, it's writing, but you see it unrolling in real time. You see things happening one after the other. It's not like where you get a book and you choose when to read it, when to go back. It's writing coming to you and passing. So in that sense, it's more like speech, but it's writing. It's also more like speech in that it's often quite hasty, unprepared. You don't go back and correct it. Having said that, there's more permanence of the signal, I've called it. I don't know if that's clear, but if you think of comparing it to speech, when I say something, it's gone and it's lost. You can record it, and you can go back and record it, but when you play it again, it's unfolding over time, and you have to keep going back and listening to it. It isn't there for you to continue examining in the same way as it is with writing. So in some ways, electronic communication is like speech in that it's kind of maybe intended to be fairly transient, unprepared, but is actually much more permanent. It's not entirely permanent. Things can be lost, but they're more likely to be permanent and to hang around, to be there in the longer term. You also get sort of real-time interaction in writing. So the sort of things that we think which are normal for speech in terms of having a dialogue and a to and fro can happen in writing thanks to electronic communications. It's very unusual for people to sit either side of a table and write notes and pass them to each other. It can happen, but it's a fairly it's a fairly unusual kind of linguistic situation, whereas people in remote situations communicating via computers do this a lot. And it's something new for the language, I think. But these communications that we write to each other are not don't go through don't only arrive on the desktop computer of or the phone of the person that we're intending to communicate with. They're very often, particularly if you're not careful with your privacy settings on Twitter or Facebook, anybody can see them, and they're permanent, remember, or potentially permanent. And that doesn't just mean anybody in your local community, it means anybody in the world, potentially. So there's a global reach to our communications. So all of these things are quite different compared to the main forms of communication of the past, and particularly through speech and writing. So these are a mixture of the attributes which are... These attributes are a mixture of things which are normally in the past attributed to speech or writing, and you get kind of a mixture of them. So it's often seen as a new mixed mode of communication through writing mediated through computers. And so it's often seen as a new mode with new registers, meaning new kind of types of situations of communication, like email, the PowerPoint presentation as well. And kind of new features of this, and things like explaining things in terms of text on a screen with bullet points. That's different. People didn't used to write things in bullet points very much at all before a piece of software came along to which kind of push you down that road. So that's I think an example of a new what a linguist would call a new register, a new way of communicating, a new situation of communicating. Now I think Simon gives a positive spin to this. I'd just like to quote from the book here. Far from being an impoverished medium, electronic communication is characterized by creativity and playfulness, spawning new words and repurposing traditional conventions of spelling and punctuation. And he explains, I think, very, very usefully how many of the productive processes for coining new words and new forms, new uses of punctuation, are actually very familiar ones to the historical linguist. They're the same processes that have been used throughout the history of the English language, forming blends like blog from two elements, a weblog, and abbreviations, shortening words like app for application, even initialisms, communicating with the initial letters of words like LOL, and playing around with, and the sort of creativity of playing around with different spellings. And he gives examples of all of these things from the history of English. I won't give you the examples now because I don't have enough time, and I want you to read the book. So he shows how, I think very well in the book, how the English language has always been in flux, and this is just the latest phase of that. There isn't, and while there are clearly very new features to electronic communication, the fact that the language is changing is not new. And to give another example of that, thinking of the features of electronic communication, it's quite often interaction, but without being face-to-face. And he describes one of the things I learned actually and started to think about for the first time is how punctuation is used a lot in electronic communications to take the place of the things that we can do in face-to-face interactions. What might appear, lots of people don't like what appears to be the excessive use of exclamation marks in emails or electronic communications, but it's a way of, in a short form of text, of expressing some of the things that you might use paralinguistic means for, with your gestures or facial expressions in face-to-face interaction. I found another quote giving a positive spin on this sort of thing from another source. So you may not all be familiar with the childish comic for grown-ups called Viz comic. This is, while I was reading Simon's book, I also came across this in a lighter moment reading this comic. This is one of the kind of phony letters that they have in this comic. Now that most kids write in text speak, shouldn't Heinz be removing a few superfluous letters from their alphabetti spaghetti and reducing the price? I think there's an opportunity for knowledge exchange and for industrial engagement there, possibly more impact for your research, Simon. You can have that. You can have that idea for free if that fits in with your agenda. But I think it does show that there are a lot of people out there thinking about the changes in the language, and but more seriously, I think that a lot of these things, actually, when I read Simon's book and when I read this, I think there's a danger actually of some of these things that we're talking about, some of the elements of electronic communication actually starting to look a bit out of date already. Things to do with abbreviated forms for SMS text messaging. They're actually kind of going out of kind of almost come and gone now already. I think that some of the things, and some of the things which are still fairly popular now, like emoticons and emojis, may prove to be very very transient actually. So see a shift towards more more image-based social media communications, for example. But also the fact, one of the reasons for recent changes is that people trying to communicate are rarely restricted to a very short message anymore. When it was rather more difficult and expensive to send text messages, they had to be very short. But most people have contracts now where they can send as many as they want, and you can send lots of text messages, and you can put longer communications on Facebook, etc. I just want to finish with a final point about what I'm calling policing grammar and policing speech. As has been suggested, Simon's, has a liberal view towards this. He welcomes, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, welcomes the creativity and exciting nature of language change, and draws attention quite a lot to the kind of that a lot of things that people object to are not really very well founded historically. But I just want to, in this section on electronic communication though, he also says, the rapid expansion of new technology and social media, combined with its inherently in-group anti-authoritarian ethos, present particular challenges for those tasked with regulating usage. I think this is very true. It's already been commented on that, the fact that everybody's out there communicating all the time via computers and the product of that is there for everybody to see, probably means there's less chance of being able to crack down on irregular usage, less chance of an academy managing to do anything about this. The genie is really out of the bottle. And also the fact that it's estimated, I think pretty reliably, that there are a lot more non-native speakers than native speakers of English writing in English on the internet, which makes it a bit more difficult for to understand what's going on and to insist on relevant standards for people, I think. But I just wanted to end with just a comment on the idea of regulating usage, because I think it's true that people that want to enforce their own particular views of grammar and spelling, etc., do have a hard time at the moment. But to be honest, that's not what I'm particularly worried about at the moment. I think a lot of electronic communication is anti-authoritarian in the sense that there's no central authority, but I think what we've seen probably in the last year or so, possibly in the period since Simon finished writing the book, there is a kind of a new crowdsourced form of authoritarianism that you get from the Twitter mob, and which is less focused on grammar and spelling, actually. As I say, the genie's out of the bottle there, but more on the content, more on the idea that you can't say that. So it's more about the content of what people are saying. So I think that I'd be interested if Simon's wondering what his next book should be on. The changes in English and free speech and the internet would be a good topic. Thanks.
Thank you. Wow, what a wide-ranging discussion. I've written down cultural imperialism, snobbery, bullet points, Shakespeare, toilet brushes, and alphabetti spaghetti. And even V's got a mention, which is fantastic. And what Martin said was also fascinating about free speech on the media. I was slightly disappointed to find out that Donald Trump can use bigly, as he did yesterday, because it goes back to the 1600s, which just shows that there is nothing new under the sun. But anyway, Simon, the floor is now yours to respond.
Thank you very much. And let me just start quickly by thanking Torch and Elika for hosting this event and organising it, and Susie for chairing it, and for the three speakers for their excellent and thought-provoking responses to my book. I suspect that giving full answers to all of these will require writing another book, but I'll see what I can do. Dr. Johnson said in the preface to his dictionary that the problem with writing a big book is that it's big. And actually, paradoxically, the problem with writing a short book is that it's short, and inevitably you have to leave out a lot of things or cut things down that you would like to have said more about. And maybe that brings me to the first point that was raised by Farah in his three questions, which he delivered to me. And the first of these is like, who did you write the book for? And it's an interesting question, because actually the book was contracted to be the very short introduction to the English language, if you know those series. Which kind of, I think, sort of does make sense of what I set out to do. And it's slightly different to the way it's then repackaged now as a hardback standalone. When it goes to paperback, that's what it will be. And in a sense, I find when reading some of the reviews that I almost want people to know that, because actually it does explain a bit more what some of the different kind of slant that there is that might be suggested by the new title. But also, it helps, I think, to position the book in the sense that it is intended for a kind of academic audience, bringing a kind of academic side to a debate which, often with these books, isn't there. And you make the nice point in your review that the eye-popping sales figures, I think, that are there for books like Eat, Shoots and Leaves, these very public, prominent, bought in their millions. Yeah, there's one there at the back. You brought it with you. But what always strikes me is that there isn't any dialogue between those kinds of books, people who write those books, and then academic linguists who want to say, actually that it's more complex than this, just simply saying that there are these standards and we have to uphold them because without them, everything would go wrong, civilization would fall down, we'd cease to be able to communicate. But on the other side, what I wanted to do was so I wanted to bring those two positions into dialogue because, I recognise that simply saying to people, well, language changes, just get used to it, isn't really a very good answer. And also, it doesn't help to explain the situation we're in, which is that obviously people do worry about standards. Otherwise, they wouldn't buy these books. People turn to dictionaries in search of authority and certainty because there are many situations in which we need to know the answer. And obviously, as someone who teaches students and reads essays and comments on the use of language, then I have to, standard English is an important tool still today. So it's trying to get that balance between thinking about, what are the authorities that we can rely on, and where do they come from? And this is why it's so useful to have Philip's views on this, because of course he is one of these authorities, or at least the OED is a great authority. And so it was trying to sort of think about the questions that underlie some of these issues. When we think about some of the so-called grammatical rules, differences between fewer and less, for instance, is one that I go into in some detail. Obviously, some people have strong views on that. This normally gets a gasp. But where do these rules come from? Are they actually grammatical rules at all? And trying to distinguish what we might think of as a grammatical rule from a stylistic preference that might vary according to language use and context. Philip talks about the importance of sociolinguistic context for understanding language use. So these are some of the issues that I wanted to engage with particularly, and maybe thinking about it as how English became English is a slightly different slant on that in the end. The question of how English is different from other European languages or similar to it is a really interesting one, and again, obviously one I didn't have time to go into in any great detail. And don't really have the knowledge to do that, but it would be a very interesting kind of parallel experiment. And it's certainly true, broadly speaking, that many of the developments that we see in English can be paralleled in other vernacular languages, but obviously the global element of it is particularly prominent with English, although Spanish, as I said, is having a similar kind of impact. And one of the things I do speculate a bit on what the future of English might be, and obviously competition between English and Spanish is one obvious area, but also, of course, now the dominance of American English and whether standard British English has a role to play in that future is hard to know. English differs slightly in that in the 18th century, which was the period where there were many attempts to set up an academy of English that would regulate it and monitor it. Of course, they all failed, whereas in other European languages, academies have often been successful. And there's a question there about, well, what does that actually mean? Do academies have any actual effect? But that is a difference. And I think you're absolutely right that the class difference in Britain is particularly significant, very striking. And that seems to me and I do talk a bit about, the origins of RP and how it became this class dialect and how it emerged specifically in that late 19th, early 20th century context, particularly associated with the public school system, the boarding school system, which is where you go to pick up your RP accent, and how it became very much associated with belonging to the right class. If you're not born into it, then you don't have it. It's good English because it's spoken by the best people, is the rather circular argument that's made at the time. So those are just some brief sort of observations in relation to what's been said. I'm conscious that what I said at the beginning was that I wanted to make, or part of the interest for me and the rationale for writing this book was to try and get debate between professional linguists, people who are just generally interested in language. So I feel that I'm bound to sort of allow enough time for you to have this kind of debate. So I think I shall stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating debate. I just want to give you an example of the sort of things that Simon's included in here, because it's not light reading, but it's delightful, genuinely delightful reading, with a lot of information in here. But you mentioned Eat, Shoots and Leaves, and Simon quotes this wonderful critic, or at least what he said was wonderful, in The New Yorker, who takes issue with the book's own punctuation, and he concludes that an Englishwoman lecturing Americans on semicolons is a little like an American lecturing the French on sources, which I think is wonderful. But thank you very, very much, Simon. I do genuinely, like all the other speakers, encourage you to read it. And it's not here because we're here to sell the book, but because we did genuinely enjoy it. So thank you. And as Simon says, if you have questions, please, now is your chance. There was just a last point for me. There was in the British Library. The British Library did a fantastic exhibition called Evolving English a few years ago, and they featured it was sort of like a Victorian love poem that was written almost entirely in what we would call text speak. So that's going back a long way as well. So we are scared of change, but it has always happened, and that's in many ways, I think, why English is so robust today. So I think we probably ought to finish it there, but thank you to Simon most of all for writing this book, and thank you to all our speakers for coming in to talk today. And thank you to you.